1871 to 1877. Establishment. Bismarck was founded as the town of Edmonton in 1872 by the Northern Pacific Railway at the point where its Northern Transcontinental Railroad would cross the Missouri River, commonly referred to as the crossing or the point. The original crossing was to be at the mouth of the Heart River and the town built directly along the riverfront at that location. This would have positioned the town directly across from what is now Fort Abraham Lincoln State Park, roughly 3.5 miles south from its eventual establishment. Construction of the railroad commenced westward from Carleton, Minnesota on February 15, 1870. Eastward construction began in Washington the following year, with the 2 points expected to join somewhere in Montana. Ahead of the line, operations consisted of establishing military posts and securing land. Northern Pacific was entitled to every other section of land within 40 miles of its road and principally responsible for selecting town sites. Bismarck's formative years were first met with optimism and greed, but concluded with panic. 1871, railroad penetrates Dakota. The earliest impetus towards establishing what became Bismarck occurred in September 1871, when Northern Pacific awarded contracts for constructing the railroad between the Red and Missouri rivers. An expedition commenced from Fort Rice on September 6, 1871 to locate the railroad through western Dakota Territory and eastern Montana. It consisted of 7 companies of infantry, totaling 420 men, 22 mounted Indian scouts, 25 Northern Pacific engineers, and 70 teamsters and government employees. Among them was Thomas H. Canfield, president of Puget Sound, Northern Pacific's auxiliary town site company, who was chiefly accountable for locating potential town sites along the railroad's path. General Whistler was in charge of the expedition itself, while General Thomas Rosser oversaw the engineering team. Rosser, a former Confederate soldier, was chief engineer of the railroad's Dakota Division and will play a pivotal role in its construction. Rosser Avenue is named for him. 1872, establishment. By the spring of 1872, the railroad was completed to the Red River and had been located to the James River. Progressing at a rapid pace, the railroad was expected to reach the Missouri River by autumn. Camps Greene and Greeley, Fort McKean. The military established Camp Greene in April 1872. Named for its commander, Lieutenant Greene, the camp was located at the mouth of the Little Heart River, approximately 3 miles south of the original planned crossing. Camp Greene's existence was short-lived. Its replacement was approved on April 16 by Special Order No. 65 of the Department of Dakota. The order appointed a board of directors, including Dr. Benjamin Slaughter, to select a site for a new post within the immediate vicinity of the point where the railroad would cross the Missouri River. In June, the military commissioned Fort McKean, renamed Fort Abraham Lincoln that November, by order of General Sheridan, on the west side of the Missouri River near the expected river crossing, on the site of an abandoned Mandan village. The fort's original namesake was a staff officer for General Hancock. A September news report stated that the fort was rapidly under construction. Fort Abraham Lincoln would later gain notoriety under the command of the infamous Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. What would eventually become Bismarck is generally considered to have been founded on May 14, 1872 when Colonel George W. Sweet, a lawyer for Puget Sound, and namesake of today's Sweet Avenue, took possession of land for a town site on an elevated swell of ground about 2 miles back from the river. Town site contest, Jackman, Burley, and Sweet. The town's ultimate resting place is not where Northern Pacific originally intended. Thwarted by greedy opportunists, the railroad and corresponding town shifted north. Early prospectors hoping to benefit from the principle of adverse possession, colloquially known as squatters' rights, interfered with Northern Pacific's plans by staking land claims along the projected route. These squatters sought to profit from what was expected to become a bustling city. Most of them acted for their own personal gain, while at least one man was employed to foil Northern Pacific. This change in location was largely attributed to two individuals who possessed privileged knowledge of the railroad and attempted to take advantage of their priceless intelligence, John Jackman and Walter Burley. Jackman was a member of Sweet's crew who, under financing from competing railroad tycoon James Hill, resigned upon discovering the crossing's coordinates and organized a 5-man gang to preempt land claims ahead of Sweet. His party arrived only hours before Sweet, on May 13, occupying roughly 2 miles along the riverfront. To the east, on or near the present-day site of Bismarck Airport, Dr. Walter Burley, who was contracted to grade the 50-mile line westward to the river, leveraged his knowledge to assert land. Sweet, who had no legal remedy against squatters, retreated to a new site where Edwinton, now Bismarck, was established. Eager to promptly procure unencumbered land, Sweet hired individuals to take personal possession of land at the new site under the condition that they would sell it to the railroad once proper title could be conveyed. When Jackman learned of Sweet's latest endeavor, he encouraged others to derail Sweet's land claims. Others also contested land in the new town site, including Dakota Territory Governor J. This inevitably led to a town site contest that lasted for 5 years, casting serious doubt on the sanctioned town's location and stunting permanent development. Carlton, Burley City, and Edwinton. With the town site location seemingly unresolved, so-called tent cities flourished along the original route, namely Carlton and Burley City, also known as Burleyton. These embryo cities, as referred to in an 1872 Sioux City Journal article, thrived in Edwinton's shadow, swelling to roughly 200 individuals with businesses ranging from saloons to trading posts. Carlton City, named for Charles Carlton Coffin, sprouted along the riverbank near the original crossing, directly across from Fort McKean. The name is often confused with the similarly named Carlton, the Minnesota city where construction of the line commenced. Along with the town itself, inhabitants staked claim to 6 miles of riverfront. Carlton was likely on the land secured by Jackman's gang. A reported 15 saloons and several homes of questionable use were located inside Carlton, giving the settlement such ill-famed nicknames as Whiskey Point, Point Pleasant, and Lookout Point. Burley City was established about 2 miles east, on or near the present-day site of Bismarck Airport. Burley City was well developed, with a newspaper article from June 27 of that year referencing such streets as Greeley Avenue and Durfee Square inside the town. It's undeniable that Burley City became the more prominent of the two, though Carlton endured longer. Burley City and the original railroad path are even represented on an early map of the region. It's unclear precisely when Carlton and Burley City were established, but each were referenced by June 1872. Burley City was mentioned as early as May. One source says the towns were established as soon as 1871, but this contradicts other sources and seems unlikely. There was little activity and few inhabitants until 1872. Furthermore, Northern Pacific didn't even award contracts between the Red and Missouri rivers until October 1871 and the railroad hadn't yet been located. Regardless, Northern Pacific proceeded at the new town site and adjusted its line accordingly, to the north. Northern Pacific officially christened the town Edwinton on August 17, one source says August 24, although there are mentions of this name prior. Edwinton was named for Vermont native Edwin Ferry Johnson, Northern Pacific's former chief engineer who first lobbied for constructing the Northern Transcontinental Railroad. Johnson was a friend of Thomas Canfield. The telegraph line reached Edwinton within a week. Few believed the authenticity of the changed railroad route and town site location. Many suspected it was a scheme disguised to outwit squatters from Northern Pacific's actual target. After all, grading work had already been completed along the original path and there was no steamboat landing within Edwinton's limits. Even so, there was doubt in Northern Pacific's ability to fend off squatter claims in Edwinton itself. On the other hand, some alleged that the original route itself was a tactical deception, a strategic attempt by Northern Pacific to thwart squatters from inception. Newspaper accounts during the time seemed just as confused, with varying accounts as to the authenticity of the actual town and even mistakenly interchanging the sprouting cities. The line change was no ruse. The squatters' stratagem backfired and Edmonton, today's Bismarck, became the sanctioned town. Even so, Edmonton faced ongoing land claim obstacles. Land ownership couldn't be guaranteed, which stunted permanent development. It would be more than a year before the town was formally platted and land made available for purchase. The earliest structures were made to be portable with the expectation that they may have to relocate. Lots located along the original route once worth hundreds of dollars suddenly were worth pennies. The isolated Burley city failed quickly, but Carleton, benefiting from nearby Fort Abraham Lincoln, prospered for some time. One source says that Carleton was wiped out by flooding in 1874, but another source suggests it lasted much longer. The squatters' actual impact on the line change is debatable. One other significant cause for the northward shift was to avoid lowland flooding, which remained problematic until Garrison Dam was completed in the 1950s. There's even at least one accounting that the town was moved inland due to a heavy mosquito population along the river. It's very likely that the line would have been altered regardless of the squatters' claims. The track was laid to within 45 miles of the Missouri River by that fall, but a strong winter storm in October delayed construction of the railroad until spring. Camp Greeley/Hancock. Camp Greeley, named for Horace Greeley and later renamed Camp Hancock, was occupied on August 8 when officers arrived aboard the Ida Stockdale from Fort Rice. Greeley's occupation marked the first formal settlement in what would become Bismarck. It was a military post used primarily as a supply depot. Dr. Burley is credited with commissioning the town's first buildings, including a mess hall for officers garrisoned at Greeley, reportedly where the Dakota block now stands on the northeast corner of present-day Main Avenue and 2nd Street, as well as a warehouse that Burley also used as his office and home, reportedly at the corner of 3rd Street and Main Avenue. Several log buildings and tents were erected at Greeley that fall. One of the original log buildings, which has since been cladded by clapboard siding and expanded several times, still remains at the site as the city's oldest surviving building. There are varying accounts as to when this building was built, and by whom. Most sources state that it was one of the initial buildings erected in the fall of 1872, but some do indicate it wasn't constructed until 1873. It may have been one of the early buildings utilized by Dr. Burley. Linda Slaughter, First School. Linda Slaughter, whose husband was the camp's post surgeon, established Bismarck's first school in a tent at Camp Greeley/Hancock on August 24. It was a Presbyterian Sunday school called Sabbath School, hosting about 6 students. The following year, she is named Bismarck's first school superintendent and establishes the first public school. Mrs. Slaughter is remembered as one of the most influential local pioneers. In addition to establishing the first school, she serves many years as postmistress, and her manifesto, Fortress to Farm, is one of the most detailed accounts of early local history. First settlers and businesses. For the most part, those who settled Edmonton during its first few months were respectable people. They included businessmen and families seeking to establish prosperous lives, staking claims, and patiently waiting for land deed clearance. That changed by the summer of 1873. There was no formal organization and no law. Northern Pacific Railway was the only agent of authority. The military was present, but not permitted to interfere in civil affairs except under very special circumstances. Even without such restrictions, the military viewed settlers as a nuisance and evaded support. Fort McKean's commandant, Colonel Daniel Houston, was quoted in saying that the settlers ought to be driven out by the military. The region became a business magnet the moment settlers arrived, which operated out of tents that were quick to assemble and could be easily relocated. This was important given the ongoing townsite dispute. They would be papered and boarded over during the winter. One Sioux City Journal article dated September 7, 1872, mentioned that businesses had relocated 6 to 8 times in an attempt to secure prime lots. The most notable first businesses included that of Asa Fisher's Billiard Hall, John Dunn's General/Drug Store, John Yegan's Restaurant and Bakery, and the Shaw and Cathcart Dry Goods Store. Some of these originated in Carleton or Burleigh City before relocating to Edmonton. The Shaw store was explicitly said to be located in Carleton in Linda Slaughter's Fortress to Farm manifesto. Established in or around May 1872, Shaw and Cathcart was likely the first local retailer. The store originated in Boston as Shaw, Cathcart, and Fisher, a partnership enterprise involving W.B. Shaw and Asa Fisher. The Cathcart connection relates to an affiliation with longtime St. Paul dry goods merchant Cathcart and Company. At the very least, Cathcart was a supplier, and may have also been a partner. W.B. Shaw, the local proprietor, had St. Paul roots, and both men may have formerly resided in Toronto. At some point, the store was relocated to the corner of 4th Street and Main Avenue in present-day Bismarck. Near Miss Prairie Fire. The new town of Edmonton was nearly wiped out by a prairie fire on October 12, 1872. The fire surrounded the town on all sides. It was believed to have been started by Native Americans to combat encroaching settlers. 1873, Panic. In the year following its founding, 1873 marked several key developments for the fledgling town that were the first steps towards establishing a significant city. Despite promising expectations, a looming national financial crisis would impede progress for nearly a decade. Initial growth was rapid. By spring 1873, some 60 to 70 buildings had been erected, many of them saloons and others of ill fame. The number of buildings grew to 147 by May. One correspondence telling in a May 21, 1873 Minneapolis Tribune article states that the town boasted a brewery, pop factory, 3 billiard halls, 3 restaurants, 4 hotels, and a handful of other businesses, including a grocer and drug store. The W.B. Shaw store, operating from a 100x 25-foot tent along the riverfront, was reported to have already sold more than $60,000 worth of merchandise, equivalent to more than $1 million today, since its inception. The store had also diversified into banking, with many deposits topping $1,000. The town's estimated population had swelled to nearly 1,000 people and was ambitiously projected to reach 5,000 by winter, according to an 1873 Minneapolis Tribune article. In reality, that population count won't officially be achieved until the 1920 census. Wild and Wicked, Murder Gulch. As it boomed without much civil authority, the town that became Bismarck evolved a dire reputation. It was known as the wickedest city in the West. The town was averaging 1 murder per day. Named for its frequent shootings and brawls, Murder Gulch was the block along 4th Street between Broadway and Main Avenues where corruptible businesses were clustered. It was also sometimes referred to as Bloody Fourth and Wicked Fourth. There aren't any references to that name in the frontier newspapers, but Linda Slaughter referenced the block's notoriety in her manifesto, stating that no respectable woman would ever walk down that street. Its fearsome reputation lasted from 1873 until about 1876. It is rumored that Wild Bill Hickok himself departed the town because he perceived it as too dangerous. In hindsight, this is ironic considering his lethal fate in Deadwood. Custer and the 7th Cavalry. The 7th Cavalry, under command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, marched from Yankton to occupy Fort Abraham Lincoln in May 1873. The cavalry supplemented infantry personnel stationed there to assist in guaranteeing railroad expansion. Custer remained there until his infamous massacre 3 years later. Edmonton to Bismarck. Edmonton was renamed Bismarck in May, with its name change officially recognized on July 17, named after Germany's Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The name change was an attempt to attract German settlers and investors. The rail line reached Bismarck on June 4, 1873, with the first train arriving the following day. The line connected Bismarck to such important destinations as Lake Superior and Minneapolis-St. Paul. Fare was 5 cents per rail mile, or $29.75 from Bismarck to Minneapolis-St. Paul. The First Presbyterian Church held its first service on June 15 in a large tent. Ground was broken for a permanent church on June 30 at the corner of 2nd Street and Thayer Avenue. When completed later that year, the building also housed the first public school. Linda Slaughter, who established the Presbyterian Sunday School at Camp Hancock the previous year, served as the school's principal and shared teaching duties with her sister, Adie Warfel. The church was replaced in 1885, and again in 1967. Burleigh County was organized on July 9, 1873. James Emmons, William Mercer, and John Dunn, all of whom later have North Dakota counties named for them, were its first county commissioners. Among their first acts were naming Bismarck as county seat, establishing a $25 liquor license, and appointing Linda Slaughter as school superintendent. The Bismarck Tribune printed its first edition on July 6, 1873 with a July 11 dateline. Perhaps the most notable headline from its first edition proclaimed, "Burleigh County organized." Several other local periodicals would follow, but the original Tribune outlasts the others. 1 month later, in August, J. E. Turner, a Northern Pacific civil engineer, supervised platting the town, assisted by George Sweet and John Bowen. It was then that Northern Pacific's Land Commission first made lots in Bismarck available to purchase, 4/4 sections of Section 5 on one of the railroad sections adjoining the present town site. Sweet and Bowen, who have streets named in their honor, were in charge of selling the lots. Little Casino, whose aliases also included Ida Lewis and Elizabeth McClellan, also referenced as McClelland, arrived at about this time from Brainerd, Minnesota and established a successful resort, or brothel, at 701 Front Avenue, then outside of city limits. She would open a new house in 1877. She diversified her interests by becoming an original stakeholder in First National Bank of Bismarck in 1879. She was arrested in Chicago in 1886 for attempting to abduct 2 local working girls. She remained operating until 1893 when foreclosure forced her out of business. She spent her final years on a farm south of Wilton, where she also operated the Casino coal mine. Panic of 1873. The Panic of 1873, an international financial crisis and depression, soured Bismarck's promising future, hastened by the bankruptcy of railroad financier J. Cook and Company on September 18 of that year and Northern Pacific's own bankruptcy in 1875. Railroad construction halted for the next 6 years. As a result, the line essentially ended at Bismarck for almost a decade. While 555 miles of line had been laid, a gap existed westward and no bridge yet traversed the mighty Missouri River. Westward rail travel was greatly restricted. When permitted by weather, trains could be ferried across the river. It wasn't until the winter of 1879, when funding became available, that a so-called bridge of ice was laid directly across the frozen river. Financial woes, limited rail traffic, little industry, and uncertain land claims stunted growth and development. Only buildings deemed essential were constructed, by the least expensive means possible. 1874, boom. In the shadow of panic, 1874 proved to be a flourishing year. While the national economic depression and correlating cessation of railroad construction did prevent Bismarck from achieving its projected 5,000 citizens, population had swelled to an estimated 1,200 to 1,400. There were 6 hotels, 18 saloons, 8 billiard halls, 1 bowling alley, 1 drugstore, 2 churches, 3 physicians, and a handful of other thriving enterprises. The W. B. Shaw store sold roughly $150,000 worth of merchandise in both 1873 and 1874, its final year in business. Burleigh County's first district court opened on June 18. Ironically, it was the railroad's sudden end in Bismarck that propelled this sudden boom. Bismarck still had one important asset, the river. Steamboat freighting was frenetic. Sustained by the railroad's terminus, steamboat cargo was transferred for further distribution from Bismarck. Likewise, the discovery of gold in the nearby Black Hills that year lured a flood of prospectors, who arrived by means of the railroad to Bismarck before setting out on their southern journey. Fort Abraham Lincoln, headed by General Custer, supported military excursions relating to the gold discovery. The gold rush lasted until approximately 1878. Major flooding struck the infant town in the spring of 1874. Like other major floods to come, ice jams on the river were the cause. It reportedly wiped out all of Carleton City, along with much south of the railroad. Dr. Fanny Dunn, Quain. Local druggist John Dunn and his wife welcomed their daughter, Fanny Almara, that year. She will become North Dakota's first female doctor, but her legacy exceeds even that impressive achievement. She was instrumental in the fight against tuberculosis, which led to co-founding today's American Lung Association of North Dakota. She also established North Dakota's first sanitarium in 1912, San Haven, and championed quality medical training, particularly for women. Despite a strong interest in medicine, Fanny first pursued teaching and graduated from St. Cloud Normal School, now St. Cloud State University, with a degree in education. For Fanny, pursuing a career in the field was prohibitive. Female doctors were rare and publicly denounced. Financing medical school was also an obstacle. Undeterred, Fanny graduated from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1898. She interned in Minneapolis before returning home to Bismarck. While working together at St. Alexius Hospital, Fanny met Dr. Eric Quain, who later co-founds Q&R Clinic with Dr. Ramstad. The pair married in 1903. They had 2 children, Buell and Marion, the first of which, Buell, is noted for his mysterious death by apparent suicide in Brazil at the age of 27. The pair later divorced. Fanny died on February 2, 1950. St. Mary's. Father John Baptiste Marie Genin founded St. Mary's Parish and dedicated its first permanent church the following year at Main Avenue and Mandan Street. It was replaced in September 1898 with the present-day church facing Broadway Avenue. In April 1877, St. Mary's Academy and Boarding School was established and creates its namesake cemetery, the city's oldest, in 1878. George Flannery. George Perry Flannery arrived on May 1 as a lawyer for Northern Pacific Railway. He soon became acquainted with Alexander Mackenzie, even teaching the future political boss how to read and write. It's quite likely that Flannery introduced the connections that allowed Mackenzie to gain credibility with Northern Pacific, later acting as its agent. If it weren't for Flannery, Mackenzie may never have achieved the great success he eventually does. Both men were critical in securing Bismarck as capital of Dakota Territory in 1883 and remained lifelong friends. Flannery held many important positions, including District Attorney of the 6th District and Bismarck City Attorney. He was also on the Education Board and was Vice President of Bismarck National Bank. He declined several prominent judgeships, including Justice of the Supreme Court of Dakota Territory. In 1878, Flannery partnered with John K. Weatherby. The Flannery-Weatherby addition in eastern Bismarck bears their name. The pair acquired a significant fortune when land values spiked after the capital of Dakota Territory was moved to Bismarck in 1883. Despite relocating to Minneapolis in June 1887, Flannery continued to maintain local business interests and investments. He found great success in Minnesota, where railroad tycoon James Hill appointed him president of Northwestern Trust Company in St. Paul. He later escalated into chairman of the company's board of directors. First elected sheriff, Alexander Mackenzie. County commissioners appointed Alexander Mackenzie sheriff on December 24, 1874. He replaced the previously appointed Sheriff Charlie McCarthy, who drowned after falling into an air hole in the river, along with Deputy Clint Miller. In the county's first public election, residents elected Mackenzie to continue in the role, re-electing him 5 additional times. The imposing Mackenzie would later become one of the area's most influential political figures and leave behind a lasting legacy. 1875, Township to City. Bismarck was incorporated as a city on January 14, 1875. Edmund Hackett was appointed the first mayor until a formal election was held in April, when John McLean was chosen as the first elected mayor. 1876, Custer Falls at Little Big Horn. In 1876, the region received national attention when Bismarck Tribune reporter Mark Kellogg was first to report on the massacre at Little Big Horn, popularly known today as Custer's Last Stand. Kellogg himself was killed during the battle. 1877, Fire. A major fire destroyed much of Bismarck's business district in March 1877. The resulting damage was estimated at $22,000, comparable to nearly $500,000 today. It was the first significant fire for the new town, and not surpassed until the Great Fire of August 1898. The fire originated at 3 a.m. on March 15 inside the Arcade Saloon, which had been bought out only the day prior to be converted into a tobacco store. Notable businesses consumed by the fire included Miners Hotel, Ostland's Livery Stable, Joe Hare's Billiard Hall, John Dunn's Drug Store, John Yegan's Bakery, John Boyle's Saloon, and Western Hotel. While not destroyed by the fire itself, Sloan's Meat Market was dismantled to stay the fire. Containing the fire was difficult. The recently ordered fire engine had not yet arrived and the town didn't even have hooks and ladders at their disposal. The Bismarck Fire Department was founded 5 days later, on March 20, 1877 as the Pioneer Hook and Ladder Company. It remained a volunteer department until 1911. Within about a week, Dunn, who suffered the largest loss at $7,000, purchased and relocated the former Congregational Church to re-establish operations on the same site. John Yegan was less fortunate, losing his naturalization papers in the fire. Wide-scale farming commences. Also in 1877, George Stark, ex-president of Northern Pacific, commenced the area's first significant agricultural operation on 100 acres of land he owned 5 miles southeast of Bismarck. He brought in workers from Minnesota to break the sod. Mandan's Collins Avenue used to be named Stark Avenue in his honor, as is today's Stark County. First schoolhouse. In 1877, the public school was temporarily housed in a building owned by William Hallstrom on North 3rd Street. Later that year, the Territorial House authorized a bond issue for funding a dedicated schoolhouse. Voters authorized the bond issue the following spring and a 2-room brick schoolhouse was erected on the southwest corner of 5th Street and Rosser Avenue. The site